right. Good day, everyone, and welcome back to the Skin Science Podcast. I'm Dr. Thomas Hitchcock, and we're here to investigate everything skin science and dissect it from a scientific perspective, analyze it from a medical perspective, critique it from a consumer perspective, and give insight from an industry perspective. Today, we'll be visiting a topic that is relevant to almost everyone at one point in their lives, usually during the teen years. But for some of us, it follows us well into adulthood, affecting self-perception and quality of life. That is the never-ending saga that we call acne vulgaris. But first things first, with me in the studio, we have the world's loveliest spin doctor, as opposed to skin doctor, Angela McDonald. Hello, Angela.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm great and thrilled to be here.
Yes, are you excited for today's topic?
Of course. I'm very excited about today's topic and our guests.
All right. And speaking of skin doctors, we have two special guests with us today. Our first guest is a world-renowned medical doctor who received his medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania. He's a board-certified dermatologist with more than 55 years of experience in the field. He's an author of over 400 papers and has made significant contributions to nearly every aspect of the field of dermatology. He began his work under the great Dr. Albert Kligman and has continued to have a major impact on the discipline. He's currently serving as Emeritus Professor of Dermatology at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. James Leyden. Thank you for joining us today, Jim. How are you?
I'm fine. For an old guy, I'm doing okay.
I could say the same. And our second guest is a friend of the podcast who volunteered for this topic during our last discussion. She's a board-certified dermatologist specializing in laser cosmetic surgical and aesthetic dermatology, a medical educator, and a highly sought-after media personality. A clinical associate professor of dermatology at the New York University Langone Medical Center, owner of a premier medical and aesthetics dermatology clinic in the Upper East Side of New York City, and author of the book 100 Questions and Answers About Acne, the always lovely Dr. Doris Day. Welcome back, Doris. How are you?
Great. Thank you for having me back.
Yes, I'm sad that I can't see both of your faces, but we had so many technical difficulties. We just decided audio was enough to get us going. So what we'll do is we'll just hear your lovely voices, and the people that are watching will have to just suffer through watching my face.
And mine.
and Angela.
It's a good-looking face.
Oh, well, I'm assuming you're meaning Angela. All right, so, the topic today is on acne, and I'm so excited to have both you, Jim and Doris, on this because the two of you, for different reasons, have in some ways inspired my research, but also, especially Jim, when I've read some of the publications. So Jim has been producing publications for a good 50 years on this topic, and some of the stuff I've been reading from way back in the day is stuff that Doris, you and I have been talking about that seems like everybody's kind of lost sight of some of the science when it comes to the microbiome and acne. And so in the studio today we also have Dr. Brian Jones, who's a colleague of ours. And he is the one that introduced me to Jim. And when he did, I started to read all of Jim's literature and got very excited about talking about some of these things we're going to talk about today. But I wanted to start out by just talking to Angela here, who's our resident spin doctor, and finding out from a basic layperson consumer perspective. You have two children at home, they're teenagers. What is the general perception in this day and age of what acne is?
Well, I have a two-sided perspective because I'm also in the industry, but in the aesthetic side of the dermatology industry. So I am the mother of two teenagers who are now 17, and we have battled acne with them. And I think, just from my perspective as a consumer and working in side-by-side or living side-by-side with other mothers of teenagers, there's just a lot of confusion, quite honestly, and a lot of trial and error, and I would say more error than success, quite honestly. It is a true battle trying to find out what is actually going to work for each of our children, and it seems to be something different for each of our children. So There's a lot of a guessing game that's going on. It appears, at least from the consumer side, when we're trying to find treatments.
Okay. Did you have acne as a child?
I did, yes.
Okay. And how is it different the way that you look at it then versus now? Is there any difference that you can put your finger on?
I think now there are more treatment options. There's some serious options. I have a daughter who battles acne, and it's treated with hormones. They're trying to control her hormones to see if that has an effect on acne, which is a bit concerning as a parent. Quite honestly, it's a bit concerning as a breast cancer survivor, and knowing that could be, in my daughter's genetics as well. So I don't love the idea of hormones being introduced at such an early age. So just a lot of confusion in general. I do not remember hormones being part of the mix when I battled acne as a teenager.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I was a teenager, that was when like Stridex was big, in those pads, the Stridex pads and
a lot
such.
of topical. I
Clearasil
remember.
was a big thing, and so Jim, you've been you're probably the most knowledgeable of all of us since you've been really looking into this for decades, since the '60s. What is your perception about how it's changed, say, from when you started investigating this versus now?
Well, it's changed quite a bit because when I first entered the field after I met Albert Kligman as a medical student, there basically was nothing known. And actually, most of the treatments that were recommended when I was starting my residency are no longer recommended because they didn't work, and some of them actually made things worse. So we have, as a specialty, we have learned an enormous amount about the pathophysiology of acne. And as a result, we have, I think, quite good treatments. And it's really not necessary for anybody with acne not to get successfully treated. I mean, the treatments are quite good. And I haven't seen a person in years that couldn't be controlled. So we think we've come quite a ways.
Right. And so, Doris, how about you? You wrote that book. And when was that book published? I can't recall. What year was that?
Oh my goodness. I'm trying to remember myself. I think it was in the early 2000s, maybe around 2007.
Yeah. So it was a while ago.
Or 2005, like a while ago.
Yeah. And so what about, since you wrote that book, how has anything changed if in the treatment or just the perception of what acne is, what causes acne?
It's interesting how a lot of it is the same. And that when I wrote the book, I'd go see a patient, they'd ask a question. I go, that's a great question. Like, why am I getting acne at my age? There are people who don't start getting acne till they hit their 20s. I never had acne as a teen. Why am I getting it now? Or going over all the different types of medications available. And all of those medications are still available today. They haven't really changed. It's that we've evolved in our understanding of acne. I think diet's a bit more incorporated. Back in the book, it was more like, well, we can't really point to anything that causes acne in the diet, but if you think that triggers your acne, then don't have that. Now we are looking more at the anti-inflammatory type of diets and even some supplements that are anti-inflammatory that may have an impact. And certainly I didn't go over the skin microbiome at all back then. It wasn't even on the radar.
Mm-hmm.
And now I think that's a huge component of it. But spironolactone, oral isotretinoin, the topical antibiotics, the oral antibiotics, all of those were a mainstay of acne treatments. Maybe not spironolactone so much, but all the other ones were. The phenacea or azelaic acid was in there. So a lot of things were kind of starting to have some data and were products that were coming up that I was able to mention that this is in the pipeline, but they were all in the book. The other thing I think is in-office treatments have expanded a lot for acne in terms of using devices like hydrofacial and other things, or even lasers to target active acne. That wasn't done at all back then. And now we have a whole bunch of lasers, whether they're Nd:YAG or erbium lasers that really do a great job, and certainly blue light that helps target acne. So I think we've expanded what we can do. And the one biggest change that I've had in my practice is that I've stopped using oral antibiotics for about 99% of my acne patients. So with all the other regimens and treatments I have available, I'm able to now no longer prescribe antibiotics as a first-line course, whereas 15 years ago, it was you come in, you get an antibiotic with a benzoyl peroxide, then you're a topical retinoid, and then you sort of weaned off the antibiotic and you continue the topicals, hoping it keeps you clear. Well, now that oral antibiotic is not as much in the equation as it used to be.
Right. And so that's very interesting that there's not a whole lot of changes within the past maybe 20 years, but over the 60 years, there has been some changes. When I think about, because you mentioned, Doris, last time we spoke about how X-ray therapy used to be used. And Jim, I don't know if you have any comments on that, but I guess we could probably all agree that it's probably not the best thing to be putting X-rays on the faces of people for acne treatment. But when we think about...
Can I say something about X-ray?
Sure.
I'm actually old enough to have treated patients with X-ray.
Okay.
Back in the paleodermatologic era, when a patient had very severe destructive inflammatory acne, X-ray treatment was 100% effective. It does exactly what isotretinoin or Accutane does. Isotretinoin induces cell death in the sebaceous gland, glands in the cells by inducing the process we call apoptosis. X-ray does exactly the same thing, but not for a chemical reason, but for the physical effect that ionizing radiation has on cells. It was 100% effective, totally suppressed acne, and most patients, very much like isotretinoin and Accutane, had either prolonged remissions or their acne never came back. So it was a highly effective treatment, but there weren't many places where you could get it, where there were dermatologists who interacted with radiologists, et cetera, so that you gave it the right kind of dosing in a way that was not harmful. It took a while. It was actually the X-ray radiotherapy treatment of the scalp in fungal diseases that led to the realization that you needed to protect the thyroid when you were aiming X-ray at the head. So it could be and was done safely, and it was incredibly effective. But we don't need to do it nowadays. But it was a treatment that was really something.
Okay, well that's an interesting perspective, because I've never been around anybody. This is the first time I've been around somebody who actually experienced implementing the X-ray therapy. Doris, were you ever involved in any of that?
No, I wasn't. And to me, the idea of it is so it's so odd. I mean, I think it's one of those things where it definitely worked, but then seeing patients years later coming in with skin cancer and even scarring and other issues, I think there's short-term and long-term. It's what we were talking about with managing hormones in women with acne, worrying about breast cancer and other things later. I think we have to take the everything into consideration as we have this conversation. So,
right.
I mean, I'm happy we don't have that anymore. But even when I look at PUVA, at psoralins, oral psoralins plus UVA for psoriasis,
right,
it worked really well. But I'm seeing those patients now, and they're covered in skin cancer. So it worked for what we were trying to treat, but it had problems down the road.
Right, and that leads us to kind of this whole concept of risk versus benefit ratio, right? And there's a certain desperation to certain people that have acne, depending on how bad the acne is, of course. But some people are quite desperate to get rid of it, and they're willing to undergo whatever it is to just get rid of it. They don't think about the long-term implications. So, I mean, really, Jim, what are your thoughts about the risk versus benefit ratio when it comes to X-ray or even other things like Doris was talking about?
Oh, well, we don't need to use X-ray anymore. And one of the things that was learned when X-ray was used, not just for acne, but for lots of things, was that dosing was important.
Sure.
And if we had not been fortunate enough to have isotretinoin come along, we would still be using X-ray, but we would know how to use it in a way that doesn't lead to long-term use of skin cancers, et cetera.
Mhm.
So that was one of the lessons that was learned, sort of the hard way.
Right.
But it was learned, if it were a treatment that needed to be used nowadays, it could be done in a way that would eliminate at least that side effect, because
Sure.
that's a matter of how you
use it.
dosing.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's actually, but that's, you know, in the practice of medicine though, is that not an issue regarding a lot of things? You know, if you don't.
I think it's a huge issue, and
Right.
one of the things it's not going to happen in my lifetime, but it will happen. It will definitely happen. We will, let's say 50 years from now, before anybody takes a medicine of any kind for any condition, I predict
Mm-hmm.
that before they do that, they will have a test, a blood test probably, that will tell, well, you really shouldn't take drug X because you know you metabolize it differently than most of the rest of us, or you have a predisposition for producing antibodies of a certain type that could lead to an allergic reaction, et cetera.
Right.
Because there's no such thing as 100% safe anything. You know,
I guess that's true.
Everything has a risk.
I agree, but when it comes to acne, I think one of the important things with acne is being able to maybe have this opportunity now in looking at the skin microbiome or the skin biome, is to say, how can we understand what's driving acne and then try to treat the source of it instead of treating what we see. And I think the sebaceous glands and even P. acnes get a bad rap.
Right.
I think they're as much victims as they are culprits in acne. And we're getting closer every day at finding better ways to manage acne. And the benefit of that is that as a whole person in a holistic way, you're healthier and your skin's going to age better and it's going to age younger and it's not going to scar. So for me, it's not just making somebody look better, it's actually making them better.
Right.
And I think we're getting there with acne treatments. And I think that's one of the most exciting things that I see in acne therapies going forward.
Yeah, I agree. You know, and one of the things that's interesting about what Jim said, I agree that the future of medicine is going to be more customized in the sense that now that we have the ability to do sequencing so readily, and it's pretty cheap comparatively, and it's going to only get cheaper. You know, there are already services where you can sequence not just your blood, but even your skin cells and such to know what your predispositions are. There's a company, I'm drawing a blank, it was out of San Diego.
Well, there's the Gallery test now, right? Have you heard of that one?
Mm-hmm.
And that's one that's looking at methylation. It's looking at cell signaling that can tell you whether or not you have a certain cancer and even locate where the cancer is. I think it's 50 different cancers it can detect. So I think what Jim said is super exciting and true, that you can tell how fast somebody metabolizes, what their sensitivities are to certain drugs, what they could take or not take together, what the best dosing might be. And that's kind of exciting because in the end, I feel like we're otherwise all going to just die of a side effect because we're going to take a pill for everything. And then there's a side effect of that and there's a pill for that. So as much as we can back off of that or know what our body can uniquely handle, I think it's an exciting thought. And hopefully we'll have that soon.
Yeah, and it totally is. But the company I was going to bring up, because when we think about the microbiome, because a lot of people think about human genetics and what we're predisposed to and such. But when we really think about the microbiome, not just the gut, but the skin microbiome as well, we have to think about how the microbiome metabolizes drugs also, or how it affects the microbiome also. An example of this is this company, I believe it's Pendulum Biosciences is the name. It's a startup out of San Diego, and their premise is that chemotherapy drugs interact with the microbiome and basically have an effect on whether that chemotherapy is as effective or not. And so they're basically looking into this by looking at the profile of the microbiome and how you should adjust chemotherapy tactics. Now they might yell at me and tell me I'm completely wrong on that, but that's based off of what I've read and seen the talks that they've given. But a similar thing is true when we think about the skin and the gut when it comes to what you talked about, Doris, which is antibiotics. When we give systemic antibiotics, for a lot of indications, it makes us feel better and it clears us within a matter of a couple of days or a few days. But when it comes to topical antibiotics, we have to ask ourselves a question: why is it that we see a much slower acclimation or a much slower effect? And part of that is one of the topics I'd like to talk to today, which is the biofilms that are part of our physiology and are considered typically a bad thing. And let's not get into that quite yet, because I do want to talk a little bit more about the microbiome. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I do want to talk a little bit first about just the microbiome in general and its role that is played in acne. And so one of the things that really excited me about Jim's work is that, for the last good part of a decade, I've been working on C. acnes, formerly P. acnes, and and then formerly before that it was C. acnes again. So it can't decide who it wants to be. But we've been working with this because I was inspired initially by Dr. Lee at UCLA to look into this microbe and the fact that there's so many different strains of it, and there's basically 3 or 4 phylotypes, one of which I believe at some point is going to be its own species, C. acnes subspecies defendans, that when we were studying it, we saw such beneficial things coming out of our research, showing that in explants, in vitro, and then finally in clinical studies in live humans, we were seeing that application of these microbes in the billions was not only not hurting the individual or causing inflammation or causing acne, it was actually causing the opposite. It was causing resolution of inflammatory conditions and such. And so, we were very much taken aback at what we were observing with this strain that, seemed to have been vilified over the years. And the interesting thing is, if you look at Jim's, and I'll let Jim speak for himself on this, but when I looked at his research and the papers that he authored or co-authored in the 60s and 70s, there was some conclusions there that people today looked at me cross-eyed when I made similar, propositions when it came to the fundamental symbiotic nature of C. acnes with our physiology. And yes, back then they didn't know about probably the multitude of different strains and phenotypes. But Dr. or Jim, what is your thoughts about kind of what you saw back then and the conclusions you drew, and kind of the interim of how people really vilified C. acnes as a species and kind of blamed acne on it for a while?
Well, I think people reacted to how the P. acnes, as we called it. It was C. acnes originally.
Yeah.
It's Corynebacterium. Then it became Propionibacterium. Now it's Cutibacterium.
Right.
But the way that the sequence of events went was that in the early 60s, dermatologists started using these miraculous drugs that had just been introduced into medicine. They were called antibiotics. It's hard for you all to imagine there was a time when we didn't have antibiotics, but we didn't. And so there was penicillin, tetracycline, erythromycin, and a sulfonamide and streptomycin, which were the first drugs that were discovered. So dermatologists, recognizing that the treatment of acne in the early 60s was at best described as pitiful, started experimenting with these new drugs. And within, 5 years or so, the specialty had decided that tetracyclines, and there were 2, and erythromycin looked like they had an effect on people who had the inflammatory aspect of acne. Then there was a seminal landmark study that was published no less than in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is, we all know, makes it one of the 10 commandments for at least 10 years. And that study was done by John Strauss and Peter Poche and Ruth Frankel. And what they showed was that varying doses of tetracycline was associated with varying amounts of clinical improvement, and with decrease in the concentration of surface free fatty acids. That led to the concept that was how antibiotics were working. And you have to realize this was like miraculous stuff. I mean, this was not, maybe it was working. Those drugs back in the day when the organisms were much more sensitive than they are today, were clearly effective. And then subsequent to that, Dick Marples and I and Albert Kligman showed that of the skin, we called it the skin microflora. We didn't, everybody loves the word microbiome. I'm not a big fan of it because we use the word microflora. Anyway, we did in a series of studies in collaboration with John Strauss's group at Boston University. We showed that reduction of free fatty acids was associated with the reduction of then Corynebacterium acnes, C. acnes, and that the other organisms that are present in the skin in various amounts had no effect. So that completed the circle. You know, the study that was published in the New England Journal says tetracyclines really work, and they work as they reduce free fatty acids. And then we came along and showed the organism that was found in very high numbers in teenagers with acne and not in age-matched controls was C. acnes. And if we reduce C. acnes, we reduce free fatty acids and the acne got better. So that kind of made for a simplistic overview that, well, acne must be due to that bacteria. Well, none of us, Strauss and Poche and Kligman and Marples and myself, none of us ever said that. We said quite the opposite.
Yeah.
We said that this proliferation of the organisms was a consequence of the increase in sebaceous gland function and production of sebum that was seen in acne patients, but not in age-matched controls. So I think the concept that kind of got out there in the general specialty out in the trenches, so to speak, was, well, you just got to kill these bacteria and acne gets better. But it's a far more interesting and complex situation and interaction of hormones with hormonal receptors, sebaceous gland function, desquamation of cells that line the follicle, and various pathways of inflammation that the proliferating C. acnes interact with. And then there's the host response to that inflammatory stimulus. There's clearly differences in the degree of response and the quality and type of response to those inflammatory stimuli that account for why some people get a face full of pimples, but they're not golf balls, and they're not leaving post-inflammation scars. So it's a very, very interesting, complex disease involving multiple factors, and Doris says she doesn't recommend antibiotics. I too, for at least 5 years, have not suggested that a patient should take systemic antibiotics because they don't work very well. They don't work anywhere.
Well, you know what I have to say,
anywhere near where they used to work.
It's true, but that was such a beautiful living history of the story of acne. And I grew up reading your papers and all the journals, and it's kind of cool to be on with you live. So that's very exciting. But that's just such a well-told, clear, and concise history. But I wish people were listening to you back then, because it seemed like C. acnes became the story and the only story, and the attack was on the bacteria as if that was, and that's why antibiotics became all the rage. One is that the tetracycline seemed to help initially, and then we knew about resistance, but also it just seemed like every time I turned around, there was a new formulation of a tetracycline, doxycycline, minocycline, and a push for just altering the dose, which I think, we're learning now that high doses of doxy over time causes mitochondrial destruction and cell senescence. They cause other problems. So antibiotics are good when you need them, but I've had patients on antibiotics for decades at a time, and they don't want to get off them
because they're scared they're gonna have a flare up. So, I mean, that's super interesting, that, the intention of the very people that brought, the science to us, was not kind of respected, and that they didn't really take the point, and who knows how that eventually, came to. But I think one of the things that we observe when we look at the acne industry, especially the commercial industry, not just the practice of medicine, but like looking at all the options out there for people who have acne, is very C. acnes focused. Now, they don't say P. acne as often anymore. Now they say things like acne causing bacteria. But regardless, it's still very focused on kind of calling out the bacteria as what is the cause of acne, where Jim just talked about the different aspects of the disease state. And one of them is actually a paper that Dr. Jones, who's sitting next to me here, put in my grubby little hands right before we went on the podcast. And it must be a late breaker, like just off the presses, right from the year 1981. But it's from Jim Leyden as the middle author here. And it talks, the name of the paper is The Relationship Between Bacteria and the Abnormal Follicular Keratinization in Acne Vulgaris. And so one of the things I think is super interesting here is that in this paper, and Jim, I'll let you give commentary in a second, knowing that you've authored over 400 papers makes me wonder whether you remember each and every one, because I probably wouldn't. But in this particular paper, kind of what we got out of it is that when it comes to pre-adolescence, you see that there is a degree of preparation for acne in the sense that there's some abnormal follicular keratinization, but it's not necessarily associated with microbes in the sense that overproduction.
Yeah, that was one of the hardest papers we ever had to get published. The idea that the organism, then called P. acnes, is sort of like the artist formerly known as Prince, was absolutely essential.
Yeah.
For acne. And what we showed in that paper with Bob Lafker and I showed was that that if you looked at the earliest lesions of acne in children that come at adrenarche or right at the beginning of puberty, which are almost always non-inflammatory, as Ann Lucky showed very nicely years ago, and mostly in the midline. If you look in those follicles, there are no P. acnes, C. acnes, whatever you want to call it. So we thought that was important, because a lot of people, not us, but but a lot of people thought that the organism was absolutely essential, and that it was basically a bacterial disease. And Ruth Frankel, who I mentioned, who was involved with the early studies with Strauss and Poche on the free fatty acid story, was then the editor of the Journal of Investigative Dermatology. And so I sent the paper to Ruth, and she wrote back. She said, "This can't be true. This just can't be true." And I said, "Well, that's what that's not a good answer. You have to say that what we did. You have to find something wrong with our methods and whatever. You can't say I don't like the story."
Exactly.
Well, that's and so we could not get it. We ended up publishing that, I think, in a journal of ultrastructure, some crazy journal, had nothing to do with dermatology.
Yeah.
But because we did EM.
No, it was JID. You published it in JID, Journal of Investigative Dermatology.
Yeah, but the first page, you have to look in the references. The real seminal paper was in the Journal of Ultrastructural something or other.
Okay.
But
that's wild. That is so
nobody
totally wild.
Nobody would listen to us that we said, we said it was not essential. It plays an important role once it gets there in high enough numbers, but it was not essential for the formation of abnormal sebaceous follicles that could lead to what we call acne.
Right. And the other part of this that made me kind of just chuckle a little bit is that I read this paper from you just now when Brian hands it to me, and I had read probably a week ago because, Doris and I are working on a book, and as I'm doing research, I came across an article where basically this group took the membrane fraction of a strain of P. acnes. And they don't really tell much about the strain. It could have been any strain is probably a pathogenic associated strain. And they took the membrane fraction and they put it into these explants, and they basically were, their experiments showed an increase in IGF-1 and filaggrin. And basically their premise was because it upregulated so highly that P. acnes is therefore is the cause, or could be the cause of comedone formation by hyperkeratinization through this, this pathway. And I kind of chuckle because
except we know that it can happen without the bacteria.
Exactly.
So
and so
a tad of a problem for that idea.
Well, the other tad of the problem was that, when you use a microbial, when you use a fraction of a strain of P. acnes, that's hardly representation of a live P. acnes strain of all the species, right?
Oh, yeah, sure. But it's even more lethal if you can have the problem without the organism, period.
Exactly. And so these are the things that, I have been, also, Jim, you say you with all of your expertise and all of your years of research and publications had a problem with it. I have been seeing the exact same thing until very recently, where I would get up in front of groups and propose certain things, and they would kind of dismiss it as, you have absolutely no way to say that because the dogma is this is the cause. It's been shown to be the cause. And so we're now coming full circle and seeing that we're finding more and more research that disproves the things that people are saying are actually dogma, and going back to the things that you and your group have been saying for the last 50 years.
You have to get. I learned a long time ago. Kligman taught me this when I was basically very, very new to the field. He said, look, most of the time people aren't either, they're not going to listen, or they don't hear, or they don't like you.
Yeah.
And they say you just have to learn to take it personally, that not to take things personally when people, the worst example of this just popped into my head is, over the years, many times I read a paper, and in the discussion, there'll be a statement and a reference, reference 32. And I say, boy, I really disagree with that. Oh my God, what is that reference? I go and look at the reference. It's me.
Yeah.
So they're saying something that I never said, and they're quoting me as having said it. So, you just have to keep trying. And,
right.
That would be incredibly irritating. I would hate that. That would be so annoying.
I find it amusing. And then when I, a couple of times if there were people I knew, I said, I saw your paper and you made a statement. They said, oh, yes. And I said, you quoted me. I never said that. And then they said, oh, really? They think, oh, that's interesting. I thought you did.
Yeah, Well, I am not yet notorious enough for people to misquote me, but maybe someday. Fingers crossed. So, Dr. Jim, do you have to leave? It's 5:00 now. I want to be cognizant of your time.
Yeah, it's 6:00 here in Philadelphia, and we're having my wife's 81st birthday party tonight at the restaurant.
Happy birthday to her.
Yes.
That's awesome.
So if you need to,
she just phoned in from the other room. She said I had it wrong. She's 18.
Okay.
Of course
you had it backwards.
Of course. We knew that though.
Yeah, right.
Well, if you need to take off, Jim, just go ahead and take off. And Doris, I'd love it if you could stay on for a few more minutes and chat with us.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jim.
Enjoyed it.
Bye.
Bye.
So Doris,
he's very, very cool.
Oh, he totally is. I mean, a little bit starstruck. I'm a little bit of a fanboy.
Can you imagine he was doing X-ray therapy?
Well,
That's so wild.
We didn't even get to.
He's going, and it really worked. I'm like, yeah, but.
Well, let's talk about that really quickly, Doris, because the fact of the matter is, there's tons of things that work for one thing, but it's like, are you jumping out of the frying pan, and into the fire?
Yeah.
And one of the things
Well,
that,
you know what, I was thinking about that
yeah,
because even when I was a teenager and I had acne, my dermatologist gave me the strongest retin-A solution, the 0.1 solution,
mm-hmm.
and said, use this every day and don't use moisturizer.
Oh,
And after a
geez.
while, I thought, you know what, I'd rather have the acne than
Yeah.
the treatment.
Most
And
people do when
so,
they take that
yeah,
stuff.
yeah,
Mm. So let's talk really about the sebaceous follicles, because you and I have talked about
yeah.
this before. And, you know, I never understood why people take the tactic of trying to destroy the sebaceous gland in order to treat acne, because one of the things that you can do is reduce science in that aspect, because the sebaceous glands are not just oil. They're not just
I know.
there's a lot that is secreted by sebaceous glands that is protective. I believe vitamin E, correct? Brian, I'm correct in saying that, right? Okay, Brian's my safety net to make sure I don't say something dumb, which I do often. But
Well, no, not at all.
but
But you know, there's actually a laser that's in development
I
now that will
know,
permanently destroy the
and I don't
sebaceous
like
gland.
that.
I don't like it either. And I had someone on my radio show, we were talking about what's in the pipeline, and they were talking about that. And I said, why would
Mm-mm.
that be a good idea?
It would
You know,
be a
you
bad.
maybe in the short run, if someone has acne, I said it's very much of a niche product for somebody who has a problem with their sebaceous glands. I mean, I have patients who are super, super glandular and their sebaceous glands are on overload
Right.
and nothing seems to work. We've done multiple courses of Accutane, but that's like one person in 5,000 or 10,000 or a million.
Right. And
It's not the typical person. You don't sell a laser based on that.
right. And maybe for things like sebaceous hyperplasia, which I have genetically, I have that myself. My father has it, and there's very little you can do to get rid of
But even
sebaceous.
that, you don't want to destroy the gland. We can just melt it back. You know, you
Okay.
just zap it
Well,
and you push it back to
I'll be
its layer
visiting
where it
you in New York
belongs.
City, and you're going to melt my, my hyperplasia.
Anytime.
Okay. Well,
Anytime.
but this is not the first company that's tried to do that. You know, there has been other
Yeah.
companies. There was a company that was out of San Diego.
Well, Miradry, right? They were trying.
Well,
They
that
do
was sweat
for
glands. Yeah,
hyperhidrosis.
that was for sweat glands. But same premise, right? Why would you get rid of?
No,
You
no,
need your
they were
sweat
trying
glands.
to get an indication for acne.
Oh, geez. Could you imagine those waffle
Yeah,
imprints on your
no.
face?
Microwaving your face
Yeah.
to get rid of the sebaceous glands.
But yeah, there was another company that ended up. It was. I want to. Was it called? I cannot remember the name right now. But they started in the same incubator
Wasn't
as
it
Zycro.
Sebacia? It was Sebacia.
No, that's a later company. This one was called like
Oh.
Sienna Pharmaceuticals or
Oh,
Sienna
Sienna.
Labs.
Right. Sienna
Yeah.
made Sebacia.
Yeah.
That's the
Oh,
company.
okay. I'm sorry. Yeah. So they,
We're talking the same thing.
yeah,
Yep.
they were making these like metal particles. I think they were gold particles or
Yes.
silver or some sort of particles, and you get them in the hair follicle, and then you'd use
Yeah.
this laser. And I remember I met with the CEO at the time. This was back when it
Yep.
was before it was
Was
bought
that
out.
Adam Rotunda, I think?
No, it was
Smart
before.
guy.
It was before him. It was this
Uh,
founder. I can't remember his name right now,
okay.
but I think it was Todd something, and he was a smart guy. But he wanted to work possibly with us because he wanted us to do some study for them. And I basically said to him, I just don't think this is a good use of
Right.
your technology. I just don't think this is what causes acne necessarily, nor do you want to get rid of this.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Yep.
he basically didn't talk to me ever again. And then he ended up selling his technology, and I don't think it went anywhere. But
Well, you know, talking about ending up in the frying pan, like you can, in the short run, maybe improve acne a little bit
sure.
by treating the sebaceous glands, but it's like hitting a nail with a cannonball. You know, it's such overkill, and you're knocking out, you're just wiping everything out. But in the long run, what you're doing is you're actually aging faster.
That's
You're
the
increasing
right.
problems in the skin, and I don't think that's a worthwhile trade-off.
No, it's
You
not.
know,
And let's
being
talk.
out of the acne age and into
Yeah,
the wrinkling age. I don't
exactly.
want that.
But let's talk about why it causes aging. Why does it cause aging? And part of that is because of the microbiome. And now, what is your thoughts on that? Why does the reduction of sebum, artificially cause acceleration of aging in your perspective?
Well, I mean, that's something that I'm still understanding and learning myself, but even just in terms of having healthy, intact skin, having the right amount of moisture on the skin, helping with water balance. If you just
Right.
want to just talk about oils and natural balance of the skin and maintaining the pH, which controls organisms in the microflora or the microbiome of the skin, which can affect how your skin handles stressors. I mean, it's some direct effects and some indirect effects. And down to the detail of the molecule, I think there's still something to be understood about that. But the one thing I know is that when you have something on your skin, and when we all have it for a reason.
Right.
And sometimes it can go awry and do things we don't want, but for the most part, it's there because it has a benefit for us.
Right.
And so you don't want to knock it out. You may want to modulate it, but you don't necessarily want to eliminate it, and certainly not scar it.
Right. And Angela, would you remember why I would say, you don't want to get rid of the oil glands of the skin?
Yes, I know exactly what
Okay,
you would say.
what would
you
I
would
say?
say that C. acnes is prevalent in the oil of our skin, and if we do not maintain that oil, then we lose an opportunity to leverage C. acnes for skin health and rejuvenation.
Right, but we just got done talking about how everybody thinks C. acnes is a bad thing, although it is not, and we know that. And it's also not just one, it's a species, not, there's many strains and many phenotypes within that species, but why C. acnes? Why is the C. acnes important for aging?
Well, the C. acnes has been shown to be able to release certain nutrients that have a profound effect on the skin, positive effect on the skin. I think one of the things in your research and the years that we've worked together, Thomas, that resonated so strongly with me, and I'm wondering, Doris, if you've heard him say this over the years, is you said, how when people have oily skin, we say they age better, and we say they age better because their skin is moist from the oil.
Retention of water.
Which is part of it. There is some benefit
Which is
to
what
that.
I just said, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the barrier, yeah.
But it's more than that. And that's because we know now that C. acnes lives in oil. And those patients who have oilier skin have a higher degree of C. acnes, which is then an antioxidant, which is a protective layer that they had naturally throughout the years that others who do not have that oily skin actually have.
So let me expound on that, because Angela is basically, trying to parrot back to me the things that she has heard me say ad nauseum. And I don't blame her for nodding off every once in a while when I say it.
I've heard it a few times.
Yeah. But, most of that is correct. And I do think, to Doris, to your point, the oil is essential, because it's not just oil in the sense that it's a homogeneous oil. There's a lot of different components in sebum. And it's essential for the barrier of the skin, which we know what happens when you don't have the correct barrier. One of the most prevalent skin diseases is atopic dermatitis, which is one of the key hallmarks of that disease, is a impaired barrier. And the microbiome is essential to this barrier, in the sense that if you don't have the right barrier, you can actually end up with diseases that are microbiome not caused necessarily, but contributed. And so with aging, the sebum itself, we talked about, it has vitamin E in it, which is an antioxidant. The C. acnes themselves are not antioxidants, but they produce a molecule called ROXP that's been studied in the literature. We found it in our isolates as well. And ROXP is a powerful antioxidant, just as powerful as vitamin C. And if you can imagine the millions and billions of C. acnes on your face producing all these antioxidants with the sebum that's antioxidant, and the propionic acid, which is a short-chain fatty acid, which a lot of people say causes acne, but actually it has a lot of wonderful properties, like it is a tyrosinase inhibitor. The salt form is an antioxidant. There's other things that we're finding out that these molecules do. I feel that the presence of C. acnes is very dependent on the oils. When we start to lose the ability to make oils as we get older, we start to see a reduction in the C. acnes and staph epidermidis, which is actually the two most beneficial commensals on our skin. And so then if we replace them, the question is, can you restore a more natural, balance of skin oils and such, and ecology and whatnot? And so destroying these sebaceous glands is actually deleterious, to Doris's point, to overall aging properly, because you're basically taking one of your key defense mechanisms away, which is your barrier, and then another key defense mechanism, which is the antioxidant layer of the skin. And if you are basically opening yourself up to, we know our cells, our own metabolism produces oxidative stress and free radicals, and then we have the pollution. If we don't have our innate, our natural barriers, we're just opening ourselves up to things like aging and cancers and such. So
And I think what's most exciting about that, Thomas, is the fact that if we do this right, it's 24/7
right.
protection. It's not dependent on you applying something on a daily basis or an hourly basis or several times a day. It's actually, if we do it right, it's something that can live on our skin 24/7. And I think that's the most exciting part of it.
Right. You know, if we truly take care of our skin properly, it's not just the skin, it's also the microbiome. And when it comes to acne, that's a huge part of this. And as we were talking with, Jim about this, you can see how research that is quite sound was resisted. These are people that are experts in not just the skin, but the microbiome. Yet then you see other publications that fly through that basically have a lot of holes in their plot. And these are the things that people kind of propagate this type of, mentality. And then it ends up being how clinicians, adopt their methodologies. And so, Doris, let's boil it down to kind of, what you and I have talked to over the years, as far as what Jim said and such. What is kind of the new kind of mentality of how we should truly be addressing acne when it comes to, what we know, the microbiome versus the human physiology, the biome together, those two things together?
Well, you fell off for the last second there. I missed your last sentence.
Oh, well, just how do we boil down what the overall kind of differences between what we, the kind of traditional way, I would say, over the last 20, 30 years of how we should treat acne versus today, where we know something slightly different as far as the relationship of the microbiome with, the human skin and what causes acne. Is there any differences that we should boil all this down to and say, these are the ways we should probably start to address acne rather than just putting, the cannons, like the scorched earth,
I think acne treatments in the next 5 years, there's been a slow change over the past several years, but I think over the next 5 years or so, acne treatments are going to be completely different. I think it'll be partly topical, but also there will be supplements that will help with acne, whether there's specific antioxidants like NMN or niacinamide that can have an impact as well, that have anti-inflammatory benefits that are specific for the skin and are supportive of the biome. So I think we're going to understand better what we put in our bodies, how that affects our skin. And also in terms of topicals, I think we're going to learn to cultivate and understand more about the different types of C. acnes bacteria, that there are different strains of them, and maybe even have creams that have bacteria in them that are going to help balance out our skin biomes. And there will be times of day where you can do it. You'll do this in the morning or at night or on some days, not every day. But I think it's going to get a lot easier, and we're going to find that not only is the acne going to get better, but the skin quality is going to be better and skin aging is going to be better. And acne won't have the stigma that it has. The hormonal balance is interesting because we do use a lot of aldactone or spironolactone for acne. And that is not a hormone, but it affects the hormone receptors. And for women who have acne along the lower face and jawline, that medicine is magical for acne. And now there's even a topical version. I'm not sure how much that really works, but the oral version works well. And I think there is a hormonal component to acne where there's either a hormonal hypersensitivity or a hormonal imbalance. And I think that's something that we still have to look at, and in terms of what's in the diet, what's in the food or water, or why are we seeing so much more of that than I feel like we did in the past? Are we recognizing it as a different type of acne now and just calling it that, or has it always been there? But I feel like that's kind of been coming up more and more as a different pattern of acne. And we need to investigate a little bit more different types of acne we're seeing, different patterns, different ages. And we're going to see that it's not just one disease, but there's a spectrum and there's a continuum, and we can break it down better and treat people more individually rather than just mass.
Right. I think that's so true. And it goes back to the whole thing we talked about earlier about more customized treatment paradigms based on the actual need of the patient versus looking at everybody as the same exact case. But part of what we're not going to get to today, because we only have a couple minutes left, was I really want, and we're probably going to have another part of this. And so maybe, Doris, if you want to join us again, we can kind of pick up where we left
Sure.
off. But I want to talk about biofilms at some point, because one of the things that I think people miss is that, and we won't start on biofilms because if I get into it, I won't shut up for another hour. But one of the things that people miss is that there is many studies that show that microbes within the microbiome produce different secretomes or different substances based on their environment. And so there are strains of acne, or I'm sorry, C. acnes, that produce a lot of porphyrins. These are typically associated with disease. And there are strains of acne that are more health associated that don't produce any at all. And so, but if you eat certain substances that are high in certain B vitamins, you see a significant increase in the disease-associated porphyrin production, but not in the healthy strains. Regardless of the strain, though, by putting those C. acnes in a certain environment, you are increasing the likelihood of seeing something like acne, because you're now going to irritate the skin. You're going to produce free radicals when you go out in the sun, and it's going to cause, an issue. And so this is a huge consideration, because if you think about, third world countries or way back in the day where acne was not really a thing, and why more industrialized countries tend to see a higher incidence of acne, you have to ask yourself, what are we putting on our skin that's causing an induction of the secretome of these different strains? Is it truly just the strains, or is it actually because we're putting them in a bad situation that's causing them to fight back? And, in today's world, we put so many things on our skin with no regard to what it does to the bacteria on our skin. And then we think, why in the world am I breaking out? Or why do I have rosacea?
Or why am I irritated? What
or
is
why
that
am I
irritation
irritated?
even doing?
Exactly. And so that's where I'm thinking in the next 5 years, I'm hoping we can kind of resolve that slightly better. And I think you and I are kind of on the same journey to investigate that. And at Crown, a lot of the research we're doing is because of my questions on this. And luckily, I'm able to kind of drive a lot of that. And so thank you so much, Doris. It's been a really great discussion with you and Jim. I wish it was longer. And I think next time we'll probably focus more on the biofilms, because quite frankly, there is probably a whole book you can write on just on that.
It's a very interesting topic, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it. So I think that deserves an hour unto itself, and count me in for that.
Right. Any final thoughts? Any final thoughts, Doris?
No, it's an exciting time to have skin, and to even to have acne, because there's a lot that we can do that is good for your skin, that's going to both help your acne and help your skin age better. So speak to your dermatologist, but also ask questions. When you go to your dermatologist, I think it's fair to say, do I really need an antibiotic? What other alternatives do we have? What treatments are available? What else can I do? Because antibiotics should not be first line treatment for acne anymore.
Right. Okay, a reminder that Dr. Day has a live 2-hour radio show called Dr. Radio on Sirius XM channel 110. Dr. Day discusses breaking news and current topics in dermatology. And Doris, where else can they find you on social media?
I'm at Dr. Doris Day, Dr. Doris Day, on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok and LinkedIn. And so I'm everywhere at Dr. Doris Day.
And she does them all
and
herself.
My website, of course.
All herself. All right. And Angela, any final thoughts?
No, I just, sitting here and kind of listening to the history of the treatment of acne, from Dr. Leyden's perspective, and then, of course, the work that Dr. Doris Day is doing today in clinical and aesthetic medicine. I'm just, grateful, quite honestly, as a mother of teenagers, that the work that these individuals have put in, and many others, to make sure that we have the treatment options that we have today. And I'm excited about the future. I think we agree, as colleagues, that what we're looking for is to change the skin, both the health of the skin and the look of the skin, but try to do so in a way that takes a more natural approach. So I'm excited when I hear the two of you talk about the next 5 years and what that's potentially going to look like in the treatment of acne versus a lot of the very harsh and detrimental things that we've seen in the past. It gets me excited about what it's going to look like 5 years from now. So
yes,
just grateful for all of the research and the work that all of these doctors are doing in the field.
Yes, and I think as we look retrospectively at the stuff that our predecessors like Jim Leyden have done, and seeing that we're coming full circle, I think we're going to be able to take a look at all of the science that we produce and makes more sense of it, and actually take a step forward in the evolution of how we treat things like acne. So I too am excited. All right. So from Media World here in Dallas, Texas, this is the Skin Science Podcast, and I'm Dr. Thomas Hitchcock. Thank you for your eyes and ears. We hope you gleaned something from this conversation. If you have any questions, comments, or topics you'd like us to cover, please message me on Insta at dr.t.hitchcock. And from all of us at Crown Laboratories, remember that skin science is for life. Goodbye for now.